Welcome to the Group Answers Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Daniel. This is the weekly show designed specifically for pastors, disciple makers, group pastors, and small group leaders. Truly, we are created to help anyone with bottom line responsibilities for discipleship. Our goal is simple: to resource, train, and encourage you in the vital work of discipleship. This is the Group Answers Podcast. Let's do it. Well, welcome back, Nicole Zasowski, LifeWay author and practicing counselor. Appreciate you making time and coming back and being with us. I hope everything on this lovely fall day is going your way up there in the Northeast.
Yes, it's so good to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, my understanding is at the time of this recording, you are post-nor'easter. Now, and also what I've picked up on the weather there is like 5 miles makes a real big difference in that area. Were you affected by that big storm at all?
We were a little bit. We've had bigger for sure. And I live quite near the water. And so depending on when the storm hits in conjunction with the tides, and as crazy as it sounds, how full the moon is, it can all make a big difference in my area in terms of like flooding and stuff. So it was pretty minimal where I am.
Okay, I have to back up just a little bit with the moon positioning. So is the tidal positioning something you are tracking, the moon positioning?
When a storm is
really
is brewing, yes, we do pay attention to it, because if the storm, for instance, Sandy was, no pun intended, a perfect storm, Hurricane Sandy, because the tidal position was high at the time of the storm hitting. And so the flooding damage was more significant because of that interaction. So we do pay attention to it.
Well, listeners, if you don't learn anything else today, there you have it. That's pretty insightful. I guess that's just coastal living or maybe unique
different
to the Northeast.
Yeah.
Well,
I grew up on a lake, which was coastal living in a different way, but we didn't pay attention to tides.
Well, in the mountains, we're not paying too much attention to it either.
I'm sure not.
So, as you know, our listeners comprised of mostly people with bottom line responsibilities in disciple making, and that there's a range there on staff positions. We have next gen leaders, we have adult leaders, we have discipleship pastors. I would say a lot of small group leaders. And so we just so everybody out there knows, we try to bend these conversations just to be most helpful. But just really grateful to Nicole, because I just think as group leaders, as people, and Nicole, I think you would agree with this increasingly, we have to understand the so-called soft skills and understanding just how relationships work and how people work to do any job effectively. But that's especially true of anybody that's in a ministry position.
Sure.
Never has not been true, but it seems like it's more true now, and increasingly more true than what it has been.
Sure.
So it's in that spirit that I would just like to start here, but just from your experience and what you have learned over the course of your role as a counselor, but also as a ministry leader. You are a LifeWay author as well. Just share 3 things group leaders need to know about group dynamics that maybe we don't know.
Well, I'm not sure if they're new to the listener, but it's interesting. After releasing my recent Bible study, Daring Joy, I've had several group leaders reach out to me with different questions about, I'm new to group leading, or this has been a struggle in our group. Can you provide any wisdom? Which has been interesting for me. I wasn't necessarily expecting those kind of questions. But I think there's so much pressure, and I don't know if this relates to anyone listening, but so much pressure to be more than we are as group leaders. And what I mean by that is, often I think we put pressure on ourselves to be sovereign or to be a savior, when we indeed are significant as a leader, but we are not sovereign in someone's life, and we are not a savior. And so just being willing to show up And usually that's a sign that if we're feeling pressure to be more, that we're in our pain. And we can talk more about that as the conversation goes on. But I think the most important thing I would share with group leaders is being really aware of your own stuff. What do I tend to feel when I'm in pain, and how do I tend to react or cope with that? That's understandable, but maybe not helpful, because that's going to get activated in a group if there's a question we don't know how to answer, or maybe someone's unhappy with how things are going, or maybe there's a conflict between group members, or maybe we're asked a question and we don't know the answer. So I think being aware of your own stuff and knowing how to steward those feelings is probably the biggest thing, I would say.
Are there things, Nicole, that you've learned? The word I'm trying not to say is actually triggers, because that's just kind of loaded. But yeah, are there certain things that we should be attuned to that lets us know that we're acting out of our stuff instead of something more sincere?
Sure.
Or more honest?
I mean, often if you picture our emotional world like an iceberg, often what we will see in ourselves is the reactivity, which does not happen. It's like a weed, it does not happen. We don't see the weed without roots. So the reactivity options, the 4 main ways that we as human beings cope or react to pain, is blame is the first one. So that could literally look like blaming someone, getting angry, raging, even being sarcastic. Or it can be quiet, like the silent treatment, withdrawing to punish someone. The second one is shame, that we would conceptualize that as something we do to ourselves, not a feeling. So a way of speaking to yourself, getting really needy or withdrawing to pout, hoping somebody will make you feel better, but you're not actually going to receive that comfort or affirmation, but you want them to keep trying. The third is control. And this is a sneaky one, because a lot of the behaviors under control are celebrated in American culture. It could look like performance, perfectionism, being really independent, but basically a lack of balance of give and take, or this idea that I can't depend on anybody else. If you've ever thought or said something like, if I want it done right, I just have to do it myself, you might be a controller. And then the fourth one is escape. And of course we can do that in a whole host of ways, but it's basically any way of disconnecting mentally, emotionally, or physically, and just kind of numbing out. And so those are clues that you're feeling something either about your identity, who you are as a person, or your value, or your sense of safety or security. So if I'm a group leader and somebody has a question I can't answer, or maybe somebody has a criticism of the way I'm running things, I need to be aware as Nicole, and I'll go first in sharing a little bit of my pain. Being inadequate is a big button for me. And so I need to be aware that that's probably going to get pushed in that moment. And I'm going to be tempted to perform or prove or please in that place. And I need to be aware of that so that I'm not making choices out of my pain. And my pain is not my fault, but it is my responsibility to steward well. And so I may have good reasons for feeling that way, but I need to be a good steward of that pain and be able to speak truth into that pain so that I can show up in a more relaxed, connecting manner than a perfectionistic, proving manner.
Inadequate. Mm-hmm. I would go with diminished. That may be the same thing.
Yeah, similar, but yeah, I like that word too.
Yeah, if I feel diminished in some way, I can feel, I've learned, and maybe a lot of the leaders out there that are listening, maybe you have learned as well. I've learned to identify that. I've had mentors say, you need to pay attention when your reaction is not commensurate with the given stimulus. But Nicole, I would hazard to guess that in the world of small group leadership, the control The control
Yes.
piece would be the
That was
number
my
one
thought. Yeah.
public enemy, number one,
Yeah.
because everything about being a small group leader, and you're right, this is where it's kind of diabolical. You
Hmm.
are supposed to be, at some degree, in control. You're putting this together, you're leading this conversation, you're taking it very seriously, you're trying to move the group along a spiritual
Yeah.
journey
Yeah.
conversationally. If you get a hiccup in that, let's just say someone introduces a, a sideways topic, an adjacent
Mhm.
topic,
Sure.
and the proverbial rabbit trail starts.
Yeah.
You can start to feel that temperature start to come up a little bit. It's like, I've got to rein this back in,
Hmm.
um, which is not wrong, right? I think you probably do need to steer it back to the intended agenda, or you feel it out. You sense the Holy Spirit guiding the room, and you kind of take a quick temperature. It's like, okay, do we need to chase this down? But those are two different things. Acting out of my pain in a control, being productive and doing my job in control, are really, maybe the discerning between those two things is not the easiest task, especially real time.
For sure. And I would say control is the most nuanced, because often people who tend to control when they're in their pain do have gifts of administration, and they are really good leaders, and they are very capable high achievers. Those are gifts that God does ask us to steward. So often it's not the behavior itself that we can look at and say that's unhealthy or that's not, with some obvious exceptions. But sometimes it's not so obvious. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, what am I looking for? Am I looking to control something that I am not empowered over because I feel unsafe or not good enough if I don't? Or is the cheese really sliding off the cracker in this conversation? And I need to do what I'm empowered to do and what I've been stewarded with as a group leader, to maybe say some hard things or keep us on track and have a conversation later, or but one of them is out of my pain so that I can feel good enough and okay. And the other one is maybe painful to deal with, but more, okay, I know that this is what I'm empowered to do as a group leader, and this is what I've been stewarded with. And so I'm going to act on my empowerment.
So let's talk about awareness then,
Sure.
in this respect. That what is the best way that I can be aware of certain things? Because maybe you agree with this, maybe you won't, but perfect handling a situation like you just described perfectly maybe isn't the goal.
Right.
Maybe the goal is actually just awareness, and at least approaching that from a healthier perspective. How can I put myself in a better place in that regard, so that I'm more aware of, am I acting out of this or am I acting out of that? Are there life practices? Are there, what have you learned, and how do you counsel people in that way?
Yeah, I think because it doesn't mean it won't be difficult to handle those situations, but we have a lot better chance. When our first question tends to be, "What do I do?" And that question is much better answered. It's kind of like the difference between feeding a person fish and teaching them how to fish. If we can know, okay, maybe I didn't handle that perfectly, but I was emotionally regulated, I was being a good steward of my pain, we have a lot better chance of showing up as an effective leader of a group or of a ministry, if we are emotionally regulated. And so the practice, and I'm kind of zooming through a lot of therapy here, but the practice is to first understand, have some insight around your story. What are the messages I'm carrying around? You identified diminished, I identified not good enough. What are the messages I've picked up about my identity or sense of safety over the course of my life? And kind of making sense of our story, not just what happened over time, but what are the messages I picked up about who I am and my empowerment in the world? And then how did I learn to survive that I maybe needed to survive back then, but is getting in the way of me being a connecting person and an effective leader now. And that would be that blame, shame, control, escape. Insight's helpful to a point, but it's not the full story. It's not going to get us where we need to go just to understand that about ourselves. So we need awareness because we cannot change what we won't name. But we also need to be able to look at those wounds, those messages, and say, yeah, I have good reasons for feeling that way. That's what's being thrown down in my life. Is that the message as an empowered adult that I'm going to continue to carry forward? Is that the message I'm going to choose to continue telling myself? And if it's not, what message can I preach to my heart right now? And then what is it, finally, the fourth step, what does it look like to practice that? What is a person who knows that they're valuable, who knows that they're significant and not diminished, do in this moment? It's not going to be blame. It's going to look like nurturing someone else. It's not going to be shaming themselves. It's going to be willing to self-value. It's not going to be controlling. It's going to be having a balance of give and take. And it's not going to be escaping. It's going to be willing to stay reliably connected even when it's hard.
So let me just talk to the leaders out there for just a second. These things are really important because your leadership, particularly, well, in any context, but particularly in a church, to lead from the healthiest place you can be is paramount. And so just to have an understanding, well, actually more than that, and Nicole just walked us through that. So to have an understanding of those lies you believe that have carried you down a road towards a false identity, and you are leading out of something other than your identity in Christ, which is your truest calling and is a lifelong pursuit, is something that needs to be scrutinized, I would say. And I think, and Nicole, would you agree with this? It is not something that's turnkey. To some extent, this is a lifelong pursuit of this kind of wholeness that we're talking about. And I think for us just to be the best, well, we're exhorted by Paul to live in a way worthy of our calling.
Yeah.
I think if we just take that at face value, that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That is living in a way that, and I think Psalm 8 says that God desires truth in the inmost being.
Yeah.
I think that comes into play here as well.
Absolutely.
How are we doing in this regard, Nicole, just based on your experience, just as a community? Have we grown in this way? Okay. So no change.
One thing I'm really passionate about as a therapist is that I think we have become fascinated with the insight part of this conversation.
Like Enneagram, all of your...
Yes. Yeah. I would, in my language as a restoration therapist, I would say the pain cycle part. So understanding those messages around our identity and safety and understanding, our reactivity and maybe why we do some of the things we do. But the research is so clear that while that is an effective step, it is simply not enough. Insight and understanding around our story is simply not enough to do the work for us. And my concern in our culture, even our therapeutic culture, in today's world, is that we are looking at that and basically it often turns into destructive entitlement, where we say, because I feel this way, I have the right. I can live in service to my feelings, and I have the right to react however I feel in the given moment. Or that understanding is enough to change. And we're just learning a lot about the brain that's simply not true. It's kind of like getting dressed for the marathon and showing up at the starting line. That's an important step to running the marathon, but you have not run a marathon if you've just gotten dressed and shown up at the starting line. Like, it's a very important step, but you've got to run the race. And that's where the discipling work that you talked about when you referred to Paul and letting and showing up and growing in the ways of the fruits of the Spirit. That's a lifelong journey of practicing preaching the truth to your own heart, as we see David do in the Psalms, and then acting on that and actually practicing that truth with ourselves and in relationship with God and other people. And so that's where I want to encourage people to go is, yes, have that understanding, but then steward it well.
It's a part of discipleship. I think we would be remiss if we said it is discipleship and the same
Right.
thing. And that's not what you're saying.
No.
But I do think, there is some tension out there in the communities as to how this kind of conversation is integrated into the disciples' journey. And I would just encourage everyone to do your own work on that. I think to be whole, to have the fullest understanding of how you relate to the world and how you understand the world and how you process things is so much a part of your discipleship and the pursuit of godliness and the pursuit of holiness. And this is just, I think the word that I would use is thread. This is a thread. This is a contributing thread to that aspect of who we are and who we are becoming. Yes. So I think that was well said. So, all right, let me ask you this. Another thing that comes up, and I think particularly this is in a next gen context. I may be wrong about that, but this idea of trauma.
Oh, yeah.
So in the world that I grew up in, trauma was reserved for a range of experiences that was pretty extreme and pretty narrow. Now, in the last decade, let's say, this idea of being offended is being conflated with this idea of trauma.
Sure.
And so I am just interested in your perspective, and I think this is helpful to ministry leaders just to understanding just who we are, because I have to admit, I think you may disagree with this, that the world has changed. You and I in our small pre-production meeting that we had, I referenced the miniseries Adolescence, which I don't know that I would recommend, but really that story is about how hard it is to grow up in today's world.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I had give that I don't think I would have said anything like, no, it's easy for these kids. I wouldn't have said that. I might have said something like, well, every generation has its challenges. But now I'm on the verge of saying, I do think there is a heightened degree of trauma in the air than maybe what prior generations had to deal with at an earlier age.
Sure.
You are a family counselor and you've been doing it for some time.
Yeah.
I'm inviting your position on this idea of trauma as the broader discussion that it has become.
Yeah, it's certainly a term that means something different than it used to. And I think we have to be aware of that as all kinds of leaders. Technically, it's a deeply distressing experience, which can be a moment, like one event, or a chronic pattern over time, or even a complicated, call that complex trauma, with lasting negative effects emotionally, mentally, or physically on our well-being. Well, that's a pretty wide umbrella. And so we can imagine, I will tell you, unless it's a really clear example, but if you take a pretty average example in terms of the way people are using that term now and ask 5 different counselors if they would characterize it as trauma, you might get 5 different answers, depending on who you ask. But culturally, it is a broad umbrella. And I will concede that trauma is much more about the meaning we make of it than the magnitude of the event. So when it comes to our identity and sense of safety, it can be a moment that maybe not all of us would consider to be traumatic, but the assault in that moment on that person's identity and safety was deeply impacting. And as leaders, I don't think it's super helpful to get into a power struggle over whether something's actually trauma or not. I think my concern when the idea of trauma is brought up is that often it's used in a way to bypass that taking responsibility for our pain piece. Obviously, our pain is not our fault. But as empowered adults, it is our responsibility. And that is one of the most healing things we can do, is to take responsibility for our story, speak truth into that pain, and start acting on that truth in the ways we're now empowered to do, so that we can pursue wholeness in our own healing and also in our relationships. That's really healing. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about trauma, it keeps people more stuck unintentionally, instead of helping them become empowered around their pain.
So you don't have a problem with the expanded definition of trauma, if it could be put this way. What you would have a problem with is when it's used in a way to foster or affirm inaction of some kind, to check out. Because I think that's right. I'll just say, someone may say, well, they wouldn't say this, but that's affected me in such and such a way, and because of that, I'm withdrawing. That would not be your advocation.
Exactly. And we see this with all sorts of things. I see this with personality tests. You mentioned the Enneagram earlier. I don't have a problem with the Enneagram per se, but when it's used as a way of, well, I'm a 2, so that's just the way I am,
I'm a type A personality,
yes.
so I'm going to be real aggressive.
Yes.
And uncaring.
Exactly. When we take something either, first of all, I think a lot of what we like to call personality is actually reactivity, but that's another conversation. But when we take something like interest around some personality traits that God has given us, or when we take an experience that's happened to us, that should be taken very seriously, and we should honor our pain. But it is not helpful or healing to use that to bypass personal responsibility around our pain. And I think that's where we've been very unhelpful to hurting people.
Collectively, do you think we take the whole idea of healing as seriously as we should?
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't think, we realize that we're the walking wounded. And so, that self-awareness piece, I think is missing as a starting place, and we can't change what we won't name, like I said earlier. And then, this idea of taking responsibility for our pain and being willing to be a good steward of our story is not one that's caught on culturally at this time.
Okay, you have a Bible study available, Daring Joy.
Yes.
And that's got to be a little different, just knowing you, than, your typical Bible study. How has this kind of conversation, or how did it inform the crafting of that Bible study experience?
Oh, that's such a great question. I haven't been asked that before. I think
that's what we do here, Nicole. I mean, we bring it every week.
I love it. I think where it relates is I kept, and I will raise my hand and say, I have adopted this mentality many times in my life as well, which is why the study kind of came from, yes, my counseling experience, but also my personal experience. This idea that joy is on the far side of a goal achieved or a dream realized or some sort of change in my circumstances. And that it was so disempowering, the mentality that I had around joy, that all the ducks have to line up in a row for me to get to experience that. And that is not what we see in the Bible. When we look at the story of the Israelites, we see, for example, that, rather than joy being a reaction or a reward, it's actually a rhythm. It's a rhythm that helps us remember the faithfulness of God and to recall his character, which actually is joy we have access to in any kind of situation. And so what these women taught me, the Bible study goes through 6 women in the Bible. Some of them hold up the mirror to the age-long human struggles that keep us from joy. And then some of them are examples of how do we actually practice joy? How are we empowered to practice joy in whatever kind of season or circumstance you might be living? And that doesn't mean that we're not honest about what hurts, but it also doesn't mean that we're disqualified from joy.
Who are some of the subject biblical figures? I know Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, so it starts right from the beginning with Eve.
Yes.
Because our obstacles of joy started then, right in the beginning. Sarah, and then Miriam. So 3 in the Old Testament. And then Mary, mother of Jesus, Elizabeth, and Mary Magdalene. Yeah.
In each one of those, there's an aspect of joy or a part of their journey that's attached to that you take a deeper dive on, a double click on.
So I would say loosely, there's 3 of them that kind of hold up the mirror to obstacles to our joy that we still wrestle with today, unsurprisingly. And then 3 of them were more examples of how do we actually practice this, whether the circumstances lend ourselves to that or not. I would say Miriam's kind of a blend of both, which makes her really interesting.
All right, here's the last question, because the people want to know. Okay. When you were writing it, who was your favorite?
Elizabeth was definitely my model in terms of I was just so inspired by the many ways that she was able to practice joy when few others could after so many years of silence from God. So she has definitely served as a model for me. I also found it fascinating that when I looked at how God designed our brain in the neuroscience research, because I believe scripture is always catching up to science, science is always catching up to scripture. That's the way I meant to say it. That a lot of the practices that we've learned are helpful neurologically for experiencing joy. In that one chapter of Luke 1, we see her practice almost all of them. And I just thought that was so fun in terms of an example of how to practice joy. Sarah's the one I related to.
That's the Magnificat you're talking about, right, Mary?
No, just the way that Elizabeth celebrated her own news of being pregnant with John the Baptist, and and then celebrating Jesus, the presence of Jesus with Mary, because there's interaction between the 2 women there. And then Sarah is the one that held up the mirror to my own struggles with this topic. So I saw myself in a lot of her reaction to joy, which I'm not proud to say, but I am growing and learning along with my reader.
So that's a really good answer. Yeah, I think favorite may not have been the best way to ask that. Like most resonant, maybe be the best way to ask that. But
no,
I appreciate you humoring me going off script there.
Sure.
I also apologize to everyone watching on YouTube that my knee kept hitting this desk and shaking the laptop. So, but that's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Group Answers Show. Big thanks to Nicole Zasowski for taking time out of her day to be with us and once again share insight. And Daring Joy, the new study, well, I don't know how new it is, but it is available anywhere that you want to buy anything. Yes. I think most of the time that's Amazon, but anywhere you buy your books, Daring Joy is available. And Nicole, I got to say, it sounds like a really good study for January. That's coming up.
Yes, I think the new year is certainly when I struggle the most with looking to the future and not trying to protect myself with cynicism and pessimism. So I love it as a January study.
Well, thanks for being with us. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Group Answers podcast show. This episode of Group Answers podcast was brought to you by our team, executive producer Angie Elkins, producer Nikki Ogden, edited by Donnie Gordon. All episodes are recorded at my personal studio in Evergreen, Colorado with the help of Riverside FM. Artwork by Lauren Urban. And I'm your host, Brian Daniel. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Group Answers Podcast.